Australia, the sixth largest country on Earth. An ancient, rugged, and unforgiving land with abundant animal life, both beautiful and deadly. Found within its awe-inspiring landscapes and natural beauty exists a deep history of unexplained mysteries for anyone with the courage to investigate them. Tonight, we join Ben on a journey across this vast island continent in search of answers to events that have reshaped the lives of so many that have been exposed to Unexplained Phenomena Australia. With your host, Ben Hurl.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Unexplained Phenomena Australia. We've got an absolutely fantastic show for you tonight, and I'm really proud to be presenting one of Australia's most famous and complex cases that we've ever seen down here. And it's ultimately also a frustrating case, and it's called the Kelly Cahill encounter. And even that title doesn't really do the encounter justice, as this was a multiple witness encounter, but only one witness came out publicly and has since disappeared from the UFO world, and the entire experience has not reached its compelling potential that it actually initially presented. And it was basically ultimately hobbled by several factors. It divided and created bad blood between some Australian researchers in Victoria and New South Wales after being given the runaround and duck shoved by various institutions. The witness Kelly was connected with the New South Wales researcher Bill Chalker, who did the right thing and referred Kelly to investigators in her home state of Victoria, to PRA, which is Phenomena Research Australia, and specifically to senior researcher John Ockertell, who conducted a thorough and professional investigation into the people, the events, the evidence. However, internal differences between the witnesses and the investigators also contributed to the demise of this really fascinating case. The Victorian UFO Research Society also missed out on this particular case, and they'd done a lot of research into some really good cases that occurred here. And politics and distrust contributed to that situation. Kelly had contacted all the wrong organisations when she made her initial inquiries, universities, the RAF, and she even contacted the Civil Aviation Authority. And they put her in touch with Bill Chalker in Sydney. And Bill's a highly esteemed researcher, but he was in Sydney. Kelly was close to Melbourne in Victoria. So it was not really workable for Bill to take control of that case. And so he chose John Ockertell and PRA to take on the case, and thus the Viewforce Victorian UFO Research Society, they missed out. And so the whole thing sort of started off in not really an ideal manner. And it also initially got a lot of media attention, including a segment on the popular Australian TV show The Extraordinary, which came out around that time. But it was ultimately the involvement of a German magazine that shut the second group out of the investigations, as they'd committed to sell their story to this publication. And so what had happened was, and I'll talk about this a bit more, this case had separate witnesses, and the second group had sort of become involved with another media organisation, and that kind of pretty much divided and destroyed the case, which had the potential to deliver a lot. So, and as far as the public and some researchers were concerned, the only document that could be examined was a book that Kelly Cahill had written, which is called Encounter. And that was written from Kelly's perspective. And the other things that have been available is some of the TV shows that came out, and various essays written for UFO journals. And ultimately, there is surprisingly little out there that delves into this case other than anything beyond basic information. And Kelly's book is a really great read, but it's not entirely unbiased. And this particular case we're going to discuss tonight really needs impartial investigation and a released report to take it to the next level, where it really may reach its true potential as a game-changing event. But now it's a very, very cold case. It's about 29 years old, nearly 30 years old, this case. And all involved have all but disappeared or were never publicly identified beyond pseudonym names, which ultimately damages the gravity of the encounter and reduces its importance and its impact dramatically. Because without the peer review and the ability to cross-check witnesses and process, this case is going to remain on the back burners. But it had the potential to be so much more. And I've had a really good time this week digging up as much information as is out there on this case. And I'm going to hit you with as much detail as I can over the next hour. So join me as we delve into this extremely interesting encounter, the Kelly Cahill encounter. So it really gained a whole lot of popularity again when in the reboot of the X-Files, Fox Mulder mentioned the Kelly Cahill case. It brought it right out again. So the case occurred on the 7th of August, 1993, which is a long time ago now. And the mentioning on the X-Files really made a lot of people sort of go, wow, what's this Kelly Cahill case? We really want to know what this case is. So August is winter time over here. So it's the middle of winter. So the 7th of August is a very cold, dark time here in Australia. It's the American summer at that time. It's our winter. And in 1993, out where Kelly and her husband were driving, it was a very remotish. It's in the Melbourne area, and now the whole area is really built out. But back then, it wasn't built out. It was still pretty much fields in that area. So I'm just going to show you that's Kelly. So she basically became quite famous as a result of this encounter. And she was very well known in Australia. And she even went to America and did a tour over there at some conferences. And she presented her story, which we're about to go through. And it's an extremely fascinating encounter. So what happened? So on the 7th of August, 1993, Kelly and her husband, Andrew, and that's a pseudonym, his name's not really Andrew, were visiting Kelly's friend, Eva, for her daughter's 18th birthday. And Eva lived in the Dandenong Ranges, and the route took them through Fountain Gate, Belgrave, and then up to Monbulk. And this little screenshot here is going to show you where she drove from. So where it says your lawn over on the right with the red dot, they were driving from there all the way along that dark blue line until the point where it goes north up to that little town called Monbulk. And I think it looks like it's about an hour and 23 minutes. It was probably longer back then. But that's the distance that she was going from central Victoria or central eastern Victoria across to the outer suburbs of Greater Melbourne. So that just gives you a bit of an indication as to where she actually was. So the trip was an hour and a half or so going through Narre Warren on the Belgrave-Hallam Road. And it was on dusk. And they were heading up to the mountains, so up through the mountains. When suddenly Kelly saw out of the corner of her eye a row of orange lights in a field. And it was 200 metres back from the road. And she saw it for really only a few seconds. And it was about 3 car lengths long. And after initially debating, she told her husband, who didn't see it and he was dismissive of it as he was concentrating on driving. And they arrived at her friend Eva's place in Monbulk just around about 6 a.m. And this picture is representational of what she saw as they were driving along in the car. So she saw that big row of bright amber lights sitting out over the field. Very strange. So the incident was joked about once they got to her friend Eva's house, and Kelly's husband Andrew left to visit his buddies in town, and Kelly and Eva went to bingo. They like to play bingo. And they left the teenagers, which was Eva's daughter and her friends, to their party. And Kelly and Eva returned home at about 11 p.m. And Andrew had already returned by that stage, so 11 p.m. at night. And they left Eva's house in Monbulk to drive back home between 11:30 and 11:45 p.m. And on the return trip, about 15 kilometres from the site of the earlier incident, Kelly saw a row of orange lights again hanging in the sky, and in the orange lights she could see figures. So this is another image of that, and this one. So this is what she's looking at that time, and she could see these little figures in the lights. So as they drew closer, they could see that the lights were hovering and twice the height of the trees. And her husband, Andrew, acknowledged that he too could see the object and the figures looking back at them. And the Cahills were about 400 metres away from the object, and the object shot off to the left at lightning speed. So it went from sitting there and it shot off at lightning speed. They started to debate about what they had seen, and they continued on when a bright flash of light appeared in the middle of the road. And this was just through what we call a roundabout, like where four roads come together and there's a circular part and you can drive around them. So they just passed through this roundabout, and it was like this big sheet of white light just came across the road, and it was blinding. But Andrew kept on driving, and their adrenaline was pumping, and they anticipated that they would see this UFO again. But as suddenly as the light appeared across the road, it disappeared. And they'd gone from 100 kilometres an hour to about 40 kilometres an hour. And Kelly said she was now calm and serene. No adrenaline-like moments like before. It was like cut to a scene in the film, like a record needle jumping, going from 100 down to 40. And she was confused as they were now on the other side of the roundabout, and she didn't remember passing through it. Both of them were feeling sluggish, disorientated, and confused. Andrew sped up the car again, and they continued home, both noticing a strong smell of vomit in the car. Yuck. It doesn't sound very good. But there was nothing other than the odour, this foul-smelling odour in the car. And when they arrived back home to your lawn, it was 2:30 a.m. So here they are leaving about 11:30, and they're arriving home at 2:30 for what is an hour and a half trip. So it had taken them 3 hours to effectively get back home again. And Kelly had a small triangular mark under her belly button with very red with sharp lines around it. And although it appeared to be burned into her, she experienced no pain. And she suddenly started menstrually bleeding outside her normal time. And it was very bright red and heavy. And she went to bed about 3 a.m. And when she awoke, she recalled a dream involving a UFO and entities. And in her dream, she recognized one of the beings as being someone who was familiar to her, and she felt like she trusted the being, although she didn't know who this being was. And Kelly had a very religious, Pentecostal type of belief system, and spent many hours reading the Bible. And she had the idea that this being was the keeper of her soul. That's her words. And on the table before him in this dream was a Bible, which she recognized as one of her own Bibles. And the being told her that she could come with him, but she had to leave the Bible behind. Or she could just leave with the Bible, And this made her distrust this entity, and she thought he must be satanic to ask her to give up her Bible. And as if the entity could read her mind, it handed her the Bible, but seemed saddened by her decision to not go and leave the Bible. And the bleeding continued for 3 weeks, but decreased in intensity, and she was not feeling well. She had migraines, which she'd never had before the encounter, and she also had stomach cramps and had lost 22 pounds of weight. So this is all in the aftermath of this, really what is a non-remembered event at this point in time. So they've basically gone home. It's taken them 3 hours to get home, and then this strange stuff is happening when she gets home, and this is without memory of what actually did happen. So this is a very interesting and highly strange encounter. So loud noises and bright lights were also causing her distress, and she ended up in hospital with a uterine infection. But she did not connect any of these physical problems with their UFO encounter that they had had. But she started to have dreams which began to trigger what had happened on that particular night. And on September 6th, 1993, a nighttime visitation occurred, and there was a presence in her room, and a suction was applied to her chest. And standing next to her bed was a tall figure wearing a full-length cloak and a black face with bright red eyes that did not glow. And she had been shocked into full alertness by what felt like a tremendous vacuum that was pulling energy out of her. And she'd received a telegraphic message not to be afraid of what was about to happen. And Kelly had this impression, and again, she was had Pentecostal beliefs. She felt that this creature was a soul vampire, in her words. And the being stared directly into her eyes, and she felt absolutely terrified. And suddenly it disappeared, and she ran into Andrew's room after that. And electrical items at home, such as the TV, began behaving oddly, turning on and turning off. And even the starter motor in Andrew's car would turn over without anybody near it. So like it was going to start itself. And Kelly received electric shocks from wood, soil, and stones. And this did not stop until the 4th visitation night in January of 1994, a period of about 7 months. Kelly still did not connect any of this to her UFO encounter, which we haven't even gone over yet. And in fact, she had completely forgotten that entire event of what had happened when they drove up to her friend Eva's house on the 7th of August, 1993. But it starts to come back. And on the 16th of September, 1993, Kelly and Andrew were visiting friends, and the topic of UFOs had come up. And their friend was skeptical, it's all a bunch of rubbish. And all of a sudden, Andrew related what they had seen, and Kelly could recall no details. So slowly over the next week, she began to remember, but it wasn't until a trip back to Eva's place in October that it all came back in vivid detail. And rather than go to bingo with Eva, Kelly sat on the couch and began to recall the events of what happened that night. And it was really very, very strange. An absolutely incredible encounter. So, what happened? On the night of the 7th of August, after they'd passed through that blinding sheet of light and they'd gone through that slowing down from 100 to 40 and feeling disorientated, they had rounded the bend and met the blinding light that they had seen in the middle of the paddock about 150 metres back. And it was the size of an Olympic swimming pool. And it would have looked something like this. That's what the object looked like. That's what they saw. So how could you possibly miss that? About 150 metres back into an open field. Really fascinating. And it was about as high as a 2-story house and brightly illuminated, as you could see by that picture. So Andrew pulled their car over, and the road was pitch black. There was no moon, no street lights. And when he turned off the headlights, the only light source was the craft in the field. And the craft was a bigger version of what she had seen earlier that evening. And it had this blue and aqua light coming out from underneath it. It was extremely beautiful, and the lights looked like they had a mist around them. Now, this is where the case gets really, really fascinating, because another car pulls up as well. So you haven't just got one couple reporting this incident, or one woman and her husband's entirely reluctant and doesn't want to have anything to do with it. You've got another car pulling up about 110 meters back behind Kelly's car. And there was a third car 25 meters behind the second car. So you've got three independent parties all pulling their cars up to look at this light, like this, out there in the field. Fascinating. And because of the headlights of the third car, Kelly could see two people standing out in front of the second car holding hands. And obviously she didn't know them at all. And Andrew and Kelly crossed the road all the way to the stormwater drain beyond the edge of the side of the road. And they stood there for 30 seconds, bathed in the beautiful light. And then from nowhere, a tall black figure appeared in front of the craft. And that sort of looked like this. So this beam of light came down from underneath the craft, and there was this being standing there, this tall black being. So it was tall and it was misshapen, and the being began to move towards them from over 150 meters away. But what also happened was a whole row of beings appeared. So the first being appeared, and then about 7 or 8 other beings also appeared at the bottom of the blue light under that beautiful looking spaceship. So that was all getting a little bit strange. And so in her head, Kelly heard the suggestion, let's kill them. And it was like a suggestion. Perhaps they should, perhaps they shouldn't. No emotion or excitement. It was almost like it was the tail end of a discussion of options. And all of a sudden, there was those 7 or 8 beings, possibly more. And Kelly felt like this low frequency shockwave hit her, like a bass amp will hit you at a rock concert. And the waves passed through her body like sound, but it wasn't a noise. It was more a horror-inducing energy that had come traveling across the field. So these creatures have sent out this bass, well, we'll call it a bass pulse, and it's hit them, and it's induced a feeling of horror. Terror rose inside her, and all at once, the being's eyes lit up. Red eyes, black beings, red eyes. And Kelly screamed, they have no souls. And the aliens, or the beings, the entities, they split into 2 groups and charged across the field towards them. And they covered the distance of 150 meters in about 3 seconds, not running, but gliding or floating across the field. And the energy had knocked them to the ground. So that energy field came across and it knocked all the people who were standing there to the ground. So in the second car, there was 3 people, a husband and wife and another female friend. In the third car was a sole male occupant, and he stayed in the car. The other 3 were out, and Kelly and Andrew were out, and anyone who was outside got knocked over by this energy pulse. And investigators later found an electric fence at the location, but they said it was unlikely to have caused such a heavy blow. And the red eyes were described as being horrific. And it was the only thing that was aimed at them was the energy from the eyes, which was And I've got another image here which sort of encaptures that for you too. So here you go. So this is showing you the beings charging across the field or floating across the field away from the light. And this is another image that also depicts that quite well. So the beings are coming across the field. The light is bathing the entire area from the craft, and the people are getting knocked off their feet. And the beings are looking somewhat like this image here. So quite terrifying stuff if you're not if no one's used to that sort of thing. So the energy from the eyes has hit the witnesses, and Kelly's thoughts were all scrambled, and a figure appeared before her. And she felt that blow and was on the ground, dazed, blinded, and winded. She could only hear Andrew telling the creatures to leave him alone. And soon after the event, both Kelly and Andrew remembered having muscular aches around the midriff, the middle section of their stomach. And Kelly, on the ground, put her head between her knees and vomited. And the creatures spoke in a clear, non-accented voice. And the message was, "We mean you no harm," which is almost like a classic cliche type of a message from an alien creature. And she described the voice as dripping with sarcasm, which is really strange. I never knew aliens had sarcasm, but that was how it was described. And it was fond of cliches and using them throughout its address. And it exhibited a sort of a contempt, as if the humans were a known quantity to them, like they knew all about the humans. And Andrew asked, "Why did you hit Kelly?" And the response was, "I wouldn't harm her. After all, I am her father." There's a lot of strange stuff. It's strange, and it doesn't make a lot of sense to the outside person looking in on this. And Kelly screamed at the creature, "You are not my father. I hate you. You are evil," over and over. And she took what it says as just pure mockery. And it's had its little joke, and it chuckled, and it was laughing at them and their belief in God. So, and when it stopped laughing, Kelly put her head between her knees, was sick again, and blacked out. And she did recall later on that she noticed that the organisation of the beings was beyond the best human trained forces. There was no hesitation. They all moved as if entirely in sync with each other, fully aware of what each other had to do. So they all had this innate connection in action. So, which is really, really interesting. And prior to the events of August 1993, there was another event. So this sort of strange things have been happening around Kelly for a while, and this is another example of that. So during a session of intense Bible study at home, Kelly said she challenged God, saying, "I want to feel your pure essence." And suddenly she described an overwhelming presence in the room. A big surge of energy washed over her, and it seemed like something was being poured into her head. And during the 15 minutes, it took 15 minutes, she was basically immobilized. So, and upon emerging from her room after this event, her husband was shocked by her disheveled appearance. And he also saw a flash of light that filled the night sky, and there'd been no lightning or thunder. And he was frightened by that. And Kelly also discovered that her unmarked Bible was missing. So she's had this strange encounter around that similar time. So, what have we got here? This case is just it's incredible on paper. Like, you've got a total of 6 witnesses. Car 1 was Kelly and Andrew. Car 2 was Bill, Jane, and Glenda. And car 3 is an unknown male. And as I said, he did not leave his vehicle. So the potential of the case is amazing. It's independent witnesses, and there was solid ground trace evidence. But Kelly's husband, Andrew, never cooperated with researchers, wanted nothing to do with it. He never was interviewed. Just, he had a Lebanese background, I believe, and he had no interest in being involved in something like this, despite the fact that he was front row and centre to this particular case. So that was a bit of a lost opportunity there as well. And the other witnesses told their versions of events, and much of it corroborated Kelly's testimony. And they were not aware that Kelly and Andrew were there, being another 100 metres up the road. They didn't know that they were there also having that encounter. But they drew similar images of the craft and the creatures, and all the women had marks on their bodies. So, which was interesting. So none of the men, or the three men that were there, had any marks on their bodies. It was purely the women. So after this strange event, and this leads back to where all the trouble started at the start of this case, that Kelly tried to relate this experience, and she was not welcomed by authorities or universities, or no one was interested in this crackpot story about what she had done. And then they told her to see a psychiatrist. And as I said, the Civil Aviation Authority said, well, call Bill Chalker in Sydney. And Bill was the first to treat her case with any serious attitude. And because of that distance, on the 4th of October, so the event happened in August, and here we are on the 4th of October now, she was referred finally to John Ockertell of Phenomena Research Australia, PRA. And she told him what she could recall, and she agreed to undergo hypnosis. And 2 attempts were made with different therapists, but neither session was successful. And Kelly said that she's not a good subject because she's refusing to give up control. So on October the 14th, 5 weeks after the first night and 10 days after contacting PRA, Kelly reported experiencing another visit. And she felt the entity was after her spiritual essence, which was somehow connected to her body. And October the 23rd, while at a friend's house, Kelly said she was again visited. But before the visit, she heard a male voice say, "Go and have a look underneath the car." And as it was dark, she did not do as instructed. And after being asleep for an hour and a half, Kelly woke up to find a black creature leaning over her with its head near her stomach. The creature was totally naked and tall and had a bulging belly, long lanky limbs. It was elongated and a misshapen head, no apparent genitals, and it had bulging but not red eyes. And she sat bolt upright in bed and screamed, and the creature jumped back from her, and seemingly badly frightened, the creature vanished, and Andrew woke up finding Kelly sweating, sitting upright, and babbling. "They told me not to be afraid, that a man was going to come and kiss me. It was going to kiss my navel, not my face," is what she's saying about this creature that was leaning over her. And so this was at their friend's house. And on the way home the next day, Kelly told Andrew about the voice, which had told her to check under the car. And Andrew rolled his eyes in disbelief, and they didn't bother check under the car. But later they heard a clanking noise and a scraping under the car, and he finally checked, and the flywheel cover had come loose and was barely attached to the vehicle. And she said after this they'd finally had a laugh about the whole thing, which is a lot of strange stuff has been happening. And Kelly could now recall that another car was there on the night, and she had seen the 2 people standing in front of it holding hands. So John Ockertell decided that he would advertise discreetly in the local newspaper, because the second car had not come forward at this point. It had only been Kelly that had come out and said, I've had this strange experience and I want someone to investigate it for me. So the second car and the third car at the start of the investigation were not at all on the radar. And so John advertised discreetly in the local newspaper, in the Dandenong Journal, in the faint hope that other people may have seen something, would have come forward. And on the 17th of November 1993, a man and a woman. He was a business manager and his wife, and the third woman in the car was the health professional. They approached John, and the three new witnesses took John to the same location in Narre Warren North, the same place that Kelly had identified. And at that point, that location had not been publicly revealed. So through a flyer that he'd put in the paper, worded in a particular way, and I've not seen that particular flyer, it became apparent that these other people had been there on the same night. So this is really good stuff, because there's not that many UFO cases where you get these fully independent witnesses having interactions with beings from independent cars. So at the time, it was a very amazing case, very strong, had the potential to be really, really strong. So the second car was, so you had Andrew and Kelly's car at the top of the hill. Then you had the three cars, the second car behind them, 110 meters down, and then the third car 25 meters back down the hill. So, and Kelly, as I said before, could only see the silhouettes of that second car as it was illuminated by the third car. The second car could not see Kelly or Andrew. So even though there's these independent witnesses, they kind of couldn't see each other, which is really strange. And the male, so from the trio's testimony from the second car, they could actually determine the location of the third car. And he was looking at the UFO's position through a break in vegetation cover. And the trio's evidence with Kelly's testimony allowed for a triangulation for the encounter with the UFO, so where each car was and where the actual object was. And the location was consistent with the anomalies that were discovered at the site. So you've got the presence of multiple witnesses, each in different positions, reporting a similar thing, adds a lot of weight to the reality of the events. If it was just Kelly alone, you could maybe attribute it to a psychological episode. But the presence of the couple, their friend, and a third male argues strongly for a real event. And the females were of great interest to the beings. The men had limited input. The two other women from the second car, Glenda and Jane, they consciously recalled onboard episodes on the big amber lit flying UFO. And they remembered the UFO and the tall black beings. And for the three of them in the second car, when they were approaching the location, they could hear a strange noise and they all suddenly felt ill. Bill, the driver, thought that he was going to faint. And he lost control of the car and ran off the road, striking a pole. And after checking for the damage, they drove off. And a few minutes later, a speeding car with high beam lights on shot past them. And another car passed, and they came to a bridge with a sharp turn, following it almost immediately. Further along this section, the trio actually stopped. And as all this was happening, Bill's vision was slightly impaired, but he had enough vision to be able to see while he was driving. But he was unable to remember seeing the UFO. And the women recalled the UFO clearly, with descriptions that were similar to Kelly's description. And so Bill seemed isolated from this event, and he had conscious recall of smells and sounds and remembers lots of activity that was going on, but he didn't recall seeing anything. And he underwent hypnosis, which brought out on-board components from the UFO, but this was smell and hearing only, no visuals. He didn't have any visual recollection of anything. And the two women did not see the experience as an abduction. They felt that they actually had free will, which is sort of interesting. But the physical examination on board the craft was not visually remembered. Other parts of their onboard experience existed in visual images and conscious memory. And the hypnosis that they underwent only sort of reinforced what they had sort of reported. So, and the entities didn't speak, and they really provided no information. And neither woman saw the other or anyone else while on board the UFO. Yet each was aware of what was happening to her companion through a psychic means. Strange, really strange. And the trio from the second car only had the experience, that experience in August. There was no other events at all for any of them. Whereas Kelly had these ongoing and other strange events happening around her, these other witnesses had only had that encounter occurred to them. Nothing else had occurred. And again, the two women had small triangles under their navels, as well as marks on the inside of their legs. And Glenda had a ligature mark on her left ankle, as well as a mark on her thigh. And both women remembered being restrained flat on their backs on tables. So just going to show you a couple of other things here. So this is Glenda's leg ligature around her ankle. And this is the inside of her thigh with 3 marks there. This is the drawings that Kelly, Jane, and Glenda had done of the actual craft. So you can see the similarity in what they were seeing from independent locations. And this is also their drawing of the beings. Kelly's on the left, Jane and Glenda's on the right. So there's a real similarity between what they're seeing. So this image gives you another picture of Kelly, and it shows you those little beings standing in the light. So really, 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 really strange. So the third car. So the third car hadn't been located at the time, but in September 1996, Who magazine, which is a big magazine in Australia, it's our equivalent of the American People magazine, was contacted by a lady who said her husband could have been that man. The woman called herself Bev, and she said that she and her husband had read all about the Kelly Cahill case, and they thought that there was a potential that the husband had been involved. And Bev asked if any of the witnesses had reported seeing a unique design on the back of her husband's vehicle. And she said that the bright design was on the protective cover of the spare wheel of his car, and the design was of a red reflective material shaped like a dragon with the word boat underneath it. And the woman included a set of photographs showing marks on her husband, and she said her husband, David, worked for the Victorian Government Law Department, and this prevented him from coming forward publicly, although he might come forward later on, but this has never actually happened. And she said that her husband did not want to believe what had happened, and it had been 3 years of disbelief and denial. And David had thought about contacting researchers, but the craziness of the whole thing prevented him from doing it. And it was only after reading the Who magazine article that treated the UFO encounter fairly that they made the attempt to contact the magazine and ultimately the researchers. And the mention of the red dragon design on the back of his car was of interest to John Ockertell, the chief investigator, as each witness was required to independently submit written reports. And Jane in the second car mentioned observing something that looked like a red dragon flying past their car as they were driving. And that meant nothing to John at the time, but in light of this new information, it took on some greater significance. And the photos of the husband showed marks on his ankle and inner thigh, which matched Glenda's marks in detail. So, and this was significant because at the time, no photos of Glenda's marks had been released to the public. So that's strong that his third guy's come forward. None of her photos have been released, and he's got photos that are very, very similar. And John kept all parties separated until his investigation had been conducted thoroughly. And neither party was informed of the other's testimony. And once Kelly was told about the other parties, she tried persistently but unsuccessfully to get their names and to contact them. And although having been told about Kelly and Andrew, members of the third party, or the middle party, hadn't shown any interest in contacting her. So it was really, really strange set of events. And I think everybody was totally confused, about what happened. And the whole thing sort of got connection, but there's also vagaries around it as well too. So it's kind of a real jigsaw puzzle of who was what, where, doing what. The ground trace evidence. So let's look at the ground trace evidence of the case. And John searched the field for traces of chemicals or electromagnetic traces, and he measured distances and photographed everything. Specialized aerial photography was used, and John conducted 11 inspections on the site, and Kelly assisted during 2 of those inspections, pointing out where everyone had been, including the beings and the UFO. And a computer grid image of the magnetic anomaly at the site, there was a magnetic anomaly, showed a semicircular impression which matched the shape of the craft. And the ground had been baked under high pressure, and there was a triangular mark as well as the traces corresponding to the witness's testimony, like a tripod had been underneath it. And I can show you a picture of that. So this is one of the tripod marks that was on the ground at that time. So the ground's been baked, high pressure, and there was these effects in that physical environment. And the marks in the formation were about 18 feet apart. So this is a big ship in 3 tripod-style lights. And Kelly didn't testify that there was landing gear, but the other 2 women testified there was like a tripod underneath this craft. The whole area was laced with a sulfur chemical called pyrene, often found in coal loads, was present, and it shouldn't have been. And additionally, tannic acid contained in some sort of the coating was present in the semicircle, but not elsewhere. So there's some slightly strange anomalies in the area. And the vegetation in the crescent area showed signs of being subjected to some sort of abrasion or compression. Not a lot of photos have been released of this, so there's not a lot to really go on and have a look at. So that's really a bit of a shame that that's the case. So what has this case delivered us? 2 groups of people, unknown to each other, had witnessed the same UFO encounter and entities. They all experienced missing time. Ultimately, each group became available to the investigator, and it enabled cross-checking and correlation to reveal similar information. The physical anomalies and the evidence, or the ground evidence, is really strong. So the ground traces, a magnetic anomaly in the area, and scars on the witnesses, on numerous witnesses have all got similar scars. And I better show you Kelly's triangle while I've still got that here. So that was Kelly's triangular shape mark that was sort of burned or seared just beneath her belly button there. So that's the strengths of the case. And the encounter showed investigation of an extremely high level. I mean, John had the experience. He had the chops to do this. He had investigated the Fred Valentich disappearance, the Melton police encounter that I've already spoken about on this show, the Knowles family. He investigated and spoke to the Knowles family and their car. We've also spoken about that. The West Turriff farm encounter, we spoke about that on one of the previous weeks. And that was including those ground and air rings, if you remember from those episodes. So John was very familiar with chains of evidence, handling witnesses, and the science involved in ground trace evidence. Like, he was the right man for the job, 110%. He'd found all the witnesses. That was an incredible thing, through his advertisement, and did an incredible job of processing all that testimony and all that evidence. But then things started to go wrong for this case. On the 16th of October 1994, Kelly and John were clashing over the confidentiality of names and releasing of information. Kelly was wanting information and John wasn't giving it to her. And as the investigator who is trying to keep everybody apart and keep the whole show together, this started to become a real friction point. So they were arguing over the confidentiality of names and addresses in the final report, and Kelly felt that her involvement was being limited, and that John had cut out large sections of the report, delaying its final release, because this report was ultimately going to be released. The original 300-page investigation had been whittled down to what was described as an unusable 100 pages or so. When the witnesses, including Kelly and her husband, began to ask for information to be taken out and refused to allow the publication of medical and psychological reports. So, and John said that when Kelly went to the media and other UFO groups like Viewforce in early 1994, it muddied the case. So the thing's starting to become, the wheels are falling off this really incredible cart. And ultimately, John's been told that the witnesses from the second car have sold their rights to a German magazine and now refuse to talk to Australian investigators at all. So he's unable to release the report. And he was under pressure due to the anticipated release of that report from other researchers. And they wanted to finally see what he'd been working on. And that was not going to happen. So there was ultimately a great feeling of dissatisfaction and lost opportunity, as no one else has been able to review the collected data or talk to the other witnesses. Even their identities remain private. Kelly ultimately walked away from the whole thing, vowing never to get involved again. So she lost interest in the whole thing, her own experience. She lost interest and faith in the UFO people and investigators that were around her. And John was unable to release his report. And this status continues to this very day. This case had a 300-page report. It is basically off limits. Nobody has seen this report. So ultimately, the most important UFO encounter in Australian history, with the most to deliver, failed to do so. And it's a situation that for the foreseeable future is really unlikely to change. Kelly wrote her book, Encounters, published by HarperCollins. I can show you that book. This is the book, Encounter. It's a great book. I've got several copies of it myself. A very interesting read. And so that came out by a big publishing house, HarperCollins. It was a big success. And it's now out of print and pretty hard to find. And the book saw a resurgence of interest in UFOs in Australia, and the media was keen to run stories. And a great Australian documentary was made called Oz Encounters. Check it out on YouTube, which included the Kelly Cahill case for a primetime TV network presentation. So it got the highest level of possible serious treatment and a lot of media time. And it even had the case to potentially become a movie. I felt it was that popular and that well known. But today it's drifted away from the public consciousness. It's become another cold case. The location is now built out with expanding suburbs, totally removing that remote feel it had when the incident occurred. The marks are gone on the ground, and unless you dig deep, it's hard to find information on the case, and nothing has changed for near 30 years. And it took Fox Mulder to reignite interest in the case in the X-Files 2016 reboot. Fans and podcasters and researchers, they all went scrambling to find out more about what the hell Fox Mulder was talking about. And it received another flicker of 5 minutes again in the media here in Australia, and perhaps that will happen again, but we'll have to wait and see. But until the situation that currently exists changed, nothing's going to change. So stay tuned. And my involvement in this case started a long time ago too. I visited the location and did a retro video there on the location on a 100-degree day. We went out there and we did a video on it. I visited the site again after the X-Files reference, and I was interviewed on that site by a local paper. And we filmed another retro on the case at that location, all on our YouTube channel, Viewfower TV. And we put in lots of time trying to locate Kelly. And ultimately, due to some great detective work, we were successful. We did find her. And her location is known, and I have actually met her. But she wishes to remain private and no longer discusses the event or is willing at all to do interviews. So a lot of potential, a lot of ultimate disappointment in the fact that nothing has been released, but I understand how that came about. And I understand the frustration that other Australian researchers have had, that we've had this really, really good case and nothing has been able to come out of it. And a few years ago, I did an interview with John Orcatel, and we might revisit that again too in a future episode. So I really, really hope that you've found that interesting. Get on board and have a look yourself and see if you can find other information out about the case. I've really just, in an hour, just flew through it all and scratched the surface. So it's been, but that's taken me well over a week to put all that together, and there's still more that could be done, and we may even do some more on this in future episodes. So thank you again for joining me, and I really look forward to seeing you on next week's episode. Have a great night.